Okay, welcome everyone to the 58th Hands-on Agile Meetup. Today we have a very exciting guest with a even more exciting topic. It's dysfunction mapping, and we welcome Michael Lloyd here. So, as you may know, I'm really married to anti-patterns. So I'm really curious about this session, and I'm really looking forward to what Michael has to share with us. And without further ado, I would say, Michael, stage is yours.
Thanks, obviously, Stefan, for inviting me. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here. I'm obviously going to talk to you a little bit today about dysfunction mapping. I'll do a little quick intro about me, but I don't want to bore everyone. Essentially, I'm Mike. I'm an Agile Coach. I'm a Scrum Master. I have been doing this for about 8 years, helping teams and organizations of various sizes. But at the moment, my main endeavor is as the founder and head of global agility for Honest Agile, which is my little one-man consultancy. And yes, I did create that job title because I thought it sounded cool, but it does also just help to remind me of my sort of personal mission, which you can see on screen, hopefully, which is to impact Agile practice globally, which I do by helping teams to deliver more value more frequently. You might also notice the hashtag there, hashtag dysfunction mapping. If you do want to ask me any questions, post anything about dysfunction mapping as you learn or use it, that's a great way to make sure that I see it on LinkedIn and can respond to you directly. But I won't bore you by talking about me. I'll get straight into what we're all here for. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. This is a story about a guy named Gilbert. And like many of us, he's a Scrum Master. He helps teams to get better at delivering value, at delighting customers. And he loves nothing more than helping teams to experiment with better and new ways of working. Also, like most of us, he has bills to pay. And so while he would like to work only with highly mature, excited, experienced Agile teams that know how to do all this stuff perfectly, it turns out those are not really the places that need his help, and certainly not the places that are willing to pay for his expertise. And so after a little while of applying for some jobs, he eventually lands a position as a Scrum Master in a big organization with lots and lots of teams that has been around for a very long time. And he starts to take a look around. And when he gets into the job and starts observing, he starts to see a lot of trouble. A lot of things appear to be on fire. So what you can probably see in the picture here are a few icons to represent some of these things. So there are, old processes that seem out of date, not fit for purpose, that's slowing things down and making things painful. There's tools and software that's out of date that's not making it easy for people to do their jobs. There's teams that are wasting all of their time in meetings and feel like they're not productive. You've got your fragile systems that break every time there's an update pushed. You've got, low customer satisfaction scores, low customer feedback scores. Generally everything seems like it's in a bit of a bad way. And I guess before I go any deeper into that, I guess I'd love to get maybe a show of hands. Does this sound like a familiar situation to anyone? Has anyone ever been in a situation like this before? Can see a couple of nods. Anyone? Yeah, a couple of hands up. Yeah, and so the reason I tell this story, right, is because honestly, it's just my little sneaky way of talking about my experience without getting into too much trouble, because I've seen situations like this quite a lot personally. It's a bit exaggerated, right? This is kind of an amalgamation of all the worst bits of what I've seen, but the truth is most of the time when you join a new team or a new organization, there's quite a lot that could use your attention. And as I've sort of started using LinkedIn a lot more and talking to a lot of other practitioners, I've learned that this is quite common for a lot of people, right? So a lot of other people have gone through this situation, this experience, and know what it's like to be overwhelmed by the kind of sheer number of things that could use attention. So that's what brings us to kind of the topic of today, right? So before I get to that, though, I know this is going to sound a bit cliche, but it's worth acknowledging that change is hard. We're operating in a complex domain, right? So how things are connected is not always immediately clear. The correct path forward is not always immediately obvious. It's not just that we suck at our jobs and that we should know better. It's that it's really, really hard to understand how these things connect, how to verify if our ideas are working for us and taking us in the right direction. In a lot of organizations, this also means that we've been through kind of change approaches and attempts to change many, many times before, often leading to not the best results. And this creates a lot of resistance or change fatigue. And even in the face of all that, though, the cool thing is most teams are still often delivering value to customers, which is something to be proud of, right? And we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much. But also the fact that we are delivering stuff can sometimes itself be a reason for us not to change, because, well, it's worked so far, right? These things are going as well as we could hope. And so why change things now? And so there's lots of reasons to not change when we don't necessarily see the value or the importance of changing. And that kind of makes it difficult for people like us, right? Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, leaders, people whose job it is to approach these problems and look for ways to untangle that mess and make things better. Whether you've been in Gilbert's like over the top situation or not, you probably know what it's like to move into a new team and be a bit overwhelmed by the number of things that potentially could be changed, and how do you start to make progress? And so given, like I say, I've talked to a lot of Agile practitioners and many say that they have seen very similar patterns. I got to questioning, why is it there doesn't seem to be a lot of guidance out there about how to kind of move through this mess? Because there's lots of guidance about, how to do Scrum or how to implement SAFe or any other number of frameworks. But it feels like there's not a great deal of content out there that helps us get from where we are now in small incremental experimental steps to something that's a bit better. So that's what I've been thinking about. And it really led me to this question, which is, what is it that's made me successful? I've had a decent amount of success over the years. I've helped teams and organizations to get better, to go from struggling to thriving. I've helped organizations completely reorient themselves around value delivery and change the way that they work. And to be honest, I've had a lot of challenges and missteps as well, but I've learned a lot from those. And so that's what got me back to this question, right? What is it that I do that works? And what if I could put that in a structure that was repeatable, that other people could learn from? So instead of having to make all the same mistakes that I did, you could potentially, find a quicker path to that experimentation, to that new way or that improvement. So that, as you can probably guess, is where dysfunction mapping comes in. Like I said, this is an approach that I've used actually for many, many years. It didn't always have this exact structure, but it's always followed this basic series of steps. And over time, I've refined it. And in particular, in the last kind of year or so, I've really tried to make it easy to digest and to teach people so that they can kind of get started with using it for themselves. And it's a fairly simple process, right? There's not a huge amount to it. It's essentially organizing stickies on a wall, right? As you can kind of see here. It starts slightly confusingly on the right-hand side and then goes to the left. And maybe a question will come up in the Q&A and we can talk at the end about why that is. But for now, just know that it flows from right to left. And it starts with these things called symptoms that connect through to dysfunctions, which eventually connects through to purpose, to solutions, and to measures. Like I say, this is something we'll all get into in a bit more detail shortly, but just to give you that kind of high-level view of the structure. The cool thing about this, right, is obviously it's a way to organize your thoughts, but also it's visible. It's something that you can kind of organize around, collaborate with people on. So it's not something that you just do behind closed doors by yourself. This is a way of kind of crowdsourcing and collaborating with your team and your stakeholders to figure out how to move through these challenges that we face. So getting into how it works, it probably starts very similarly to how you would start today as a coach, as a Scrum Master, joining a new team or organization. So you're going to want to observe, right? You're going to want to understand the context that you're in. You're going to want to listen and ask questions. You're going to want to get a feeling for the process that the organization and the team is using. So during that time, you're attending events, you're interviewing your customers and your stakeholders. You're just generally walking around the organization, or maybe virtually walking around the organization to get a sense of what's going on. Really importantly, though, this first step does not include problem solving. I very deliberately build this into the process because it was a mistake that I made early on, which trying to solve problems too soon, maybe because I'd seen something work elsewhere or I'd read something in a theory book and just wanted to implement it right away, not understanding the local context. And so the idea here is you start by observing, by understanding, by collecting your thoughts of the situation that you're in. But you're not just sitting quietly, right? You're not just doing nothing and observing. You're writing things down, which again, many of us probably already do today. The way I do this now is I collect things on digital sticky notes, but you're trying to get a sense of, what are people complaining about? What makes life painful? What are the things that make it miserable for people to come into work of a day and capture as much of that as possible? And this step is what I call forming a funnel. The funnel is basically just a backlog of potential problems that you want to solve that you'll use later as you form your dysfunction map. So the more you capture at this point, the more you'll have to draw from later on when you get to forming that map. So there's a few examples on screen here. In reality, you get a lot more than this, but you can see some examples. There are things there that say stuff like, PO doesn't attend sprint planning, unfinished work is being shown at the sprint review, daily scrum is a status update. So these all represent things that you might see or hear or be told about that represents some challenge or problem in your team or your organization. And this is the start of how this empirical process works, right? It's based on what we are really seeing and observing in the teams, not just a theoretical view of the world. But even figuring out what to capture on a funnel, I found can be difficult for people. So especially if you're a newer Agile practitioner, or you've recently moved into a new team or a new domain where you don't understand the context. So when I do my full dysfunction mapping workshop, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end, I do give a lot more guidance on how to kind of walk through this part of the process, which essentially involves these cards that you can see on screen that essentially act like prompts to get your creative juices flowing. So that, the prompt cards are things like who is arguing and why, that help you capture conflict events. Observation cards like the team doesn't set sprint goals, which kind of reminds you of anti-patterns that you might not want to ignore. And I'm sure that you'll get a lot more examples of things like that in Stefan's book that I'm sure we can talk about a bit at the end too. And then conversation cards like the product is full of bugs, that give examples of things that you might overhear in conversations or other people's conversations that, again, are things you might want to write down. All of this stuff that I've just mentioned is not, a distinct part of dysfunction mapping. These are just extra tools that I offer to help you get through that process. You could build your funnel entirely just on your own observations and experience. That would be fine too. The cards just exist as like an extra little aid. And so eventually you're going to have a big, robust funnel. You're going to have a lot of stuff written down, and you're probably going to start seeing things repeat themselves, right? You'll go to write something down and you'll notice that it's already there in some form in your funnel. And so once you kind of stop getting new insights from those conversations and observations, that's probably the sign that you're ready to move on to the next stage, ready to get into problem solving. In my experience, I say allow about 2 weeks for this part of the process. Don't jump straight to problem solving. Allow a couple of weeks to really kind of build that funnel and get a sense of what's going on. You can find ways to, you can write things down multiple times. You can tally things. That's fine. But if all you're doing is adding stuff that's already there, that's the sign that it's time to go to potential problem solving. Another great quote here that I love that you might recognize: companies that reward firefighters create a culture of arsonists. One of the risks that I found early in my career is that we can turn into very reactive problem solvers. We always want to jump on, the latest fire, when what we want is a proactive approach. We want to solve the right problems, the big problems. And when we don't have a proactive approach, we can get drawn into these very different and sometimes dangerous ways to problem solve. So the squeaky wheel syndrome, where we just go to whoever complains the loudest, the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, where we just do what the CEO or the senior exec tells us to do. And then, of course, the fireman, which is where we're just always jumping on the latest fire. So if we don't want one of those approaches, if we want a proactive approach, how do we get there? Well, that's kind of that first big stage of dysfunction mapping, which is forming themes. So this is essentially where we connect a root dysfunction to multiple symptoms. Now, I'll go into in a second into what the difference is between dysfunction and a symptom, but for now, what I'm really just trying to let you see is that we're looking for a one-to-many relationship, because if we can find a dysfunction that potentially connects to multiple symptoms, that's our proactive action, right? Because we're identifying the biggest, most impactful thing we can do. And these are things that we're drawing in from our funnel. So they represent things that people have been telling us about, that we've been seeing. They're not just theory. They're based on what's actually happening in our teams. So how do you do that, right? What's the difference between a dysfunction and a symptom? So in this context, I use an analogy to kind of simplify it a little bit. A symptom is like having a fever, right? A fever is a warning sign that there's something wrong. And if you go to the doctor, they're not going to just try to treat the fever. They're going to try and figure out, do you have a virus or an infection? And then they're going to try and treat that root cause, the underlying issue. Now, that doesn't mean that the fever is irrelevant, that they're going to ignore it, because actually by observing the fever and seeing if it goes away, that tells them that they might be addressing the right root cause. So it's a useful mechanism to make sure the right thing is being addressed. So the symptom is the fever, but the dysfunction, the abnormality or the impairment is the underlying condition that kind of creates that negative outcome. So putting that into a more product delivery focus that hopefully makes a bit more sense. Symptoms are the negative outcomes that result from our bad or misapplied practices, right? So conflict between teams, inability to achieve our goals or our outcomes, diminishing quality of our products or services. Those are all symptoms that indicate some deeper underlying problem. But dysfunction is the underlying thing that we're either doing wrong or not doing, that impairment, that leads to those symptoms. And when I talk about impairment, I'm really talking about an impairment relative to some known good practice. So using Scrum as an easy example, right? Anytime that we break a rule of Scrum, we could call that a dysfunction relative to good Scrum practice. So example, not setting a sprint goal. Scrum tells us that a team should set a single sprint goal for each sprint. If we don't do that, that would be a dysfunction. And it makes sense that could cause some of our negative outcomes that we're seeing. And so we might hypothesize that those are related and tie them together on our dysfunction map. So I'll put a couple of examples on screen so you can see them here. Hopefully those are readable. So just to clarify again, what we're really trying to connect here is negative outcomes connected to some deviation from known good practice. And so, for example, there's one here that says that a team that has lots of unfinished work every sprint, they constantly have new work pushed into this sprint, and they show unfinished work at their sprint reviews, and their daily Scrum overruns every day. Those are all symptoms that I've captured. And the dysfunction I've connected that to is that the product owner doesn't attend sprint planning. So again, this is just a hypothesis at this point, right? I don't know, but I'm suspecting that if the product owner were to attend sprint planning, that I might see some of those symptoms go away. And that's something that I then want to go and test by taking some action. So there are a bunch of other cards, again, that I offer to kind of give a bit more guidance as you go through this process, and we won't go into them in detail. But there are dysfunction cards that all represent specific rules of Scrum that we might be breaking. And then there are these symptom cards that kind of augment your observations with examples of symptoms that you could be looking for. Again, these cards can be completely ignored. They're not a required part of the process. They're just part of the larger workshop to help kind of work through and learn how this tool works. It's worth noting as well that I'm using Scrum a lot as an example here because, to be honest, it's just the thing that most of us are going to be the most familiar with, and so we can talk about examples more easily. But dysfunction mapping doesn't have to be tied to Scrum. I really like this graphic. I didn't create it myself. It's just one that I like to reuse that talks about the relationship between the Agile mindset, the values, the principles, and then, of course, all the different practices that exist to help enable that. Scrum is one of those practices, or Scrum even has practices within it. But you can equally think about things like Kanban or DevOps. You could think about scaling frameworks. Any practice that you could point to that we think could be the cause of some of our negative outcomes, or that if we were to implement some approach might solve those things, well, that's worth thinking about. There's no right or wrong to any of this. So this one's a bit pompous because I'm quoting myself here, but I say this in every workshop that I do, and it's really, really important for understanding dysfunction mapping. Effective coaching comes not from enforcing rules, but helping people to understand purpose. So once we've done this first step, we found our themes and we've identified some of our dysfunctions, our rules or practices that we think could be the cause of problems. It can be really, really tempting to just see our role then to be to implement or enforce those rules. But effective coaching, in my experience, isn't about beating the rule book and forcing people to comply, right? It's about helping them understand why the rules exist and how they can change in order to make things better and to solve the problems that they themselves potentially have brought to you. And so that's why that next step in dysfunction mapping is all about purpose. This is about understanding why a rule exists before we try to influence change. So, for example, why does Scrum say that a team should set a single sprint goal? Why does Scrum say that the product owner should attend sprint planning? Because if I can't answer that question, I'm not yet ready to influence change, right? I should be able to give a compelling reason to someone who's not a coach or not a Scrum Master that they understand what the benefit to them is of working in this way, of using this process or this framework or tool. And if you can't answer that question, or if you can't come up with the compelling purpose, this is your chance to step back and have a think, read the Scrum Guide, watch some YouTube videos. Just really make sure you understand what you're trying to influence before you try to make people change. So there's an example here that says, the team does not set a single sprint goal. And the purpose statement that I've connected to that is a single sprint goal provides focus and it enables rapid decision making. So instead of going to someone saying you should set a sprint goal because the Scrum Guide says so, I can help them understand the value of focus and rapid decision making, which is probably going to be a much better way of bringing them on board and getting buy-in for that change. So now that I understand it, I can help them understand it. And so that's where this then sits on the dysfunction map. Next to dysfunction, every dysfunction has a purpose statement connected to it, and it should clearly articulate the value of that practice that we are potentially missing. Here's another one you might be familiar with. I'd love to know if anyone's experienced this. Have you ever gone to share an approach, a change of a way of working with a team member, with a stakeholder or a leader, and they've just gotten mad at you, and they just don't like that you're giving them alternate ways of working. I think maybe another raise hand if anyone's experienced that one. Got a couple of smiles, a couple of raised hands. So yeah, again, I'm glad to know it's not just me. And this happens quite a lot, right? Because I think sometimes we forget that people have come to their way of working through their own expertise, through their own experience. They don't necessarily want to just be told that you know a better way of working. And so this purpose step is a really, really good way of getting past that, because instead of coming to someone with a, you should do this because I said so, just trust me, what you're coming to them with is essentially the collective intelligence of all of these other tools or frameworks that we have potentially agreed as a team that we want to use, like Scrum, for example. So instead of just saying, you should do X, you can come to them with the benefit of change, and then hopefully tied to the symptoms or the things that we talked about earlier, that then bring them into that journey and make them want to change. Another reason this purpose step is super important is because it shifts us into positive, right? Dysfunction as a word can be seen as a bit negative, talking about what we're not doing or what we're not doing right. By going from dysfunction and into purpose, we're basically flipping that switch, going from talking about negatives and talking about positives, which again gives us hopefully just an easier journey, an easier path to getting people on board for why we should change. And I can see someone in the comments has said, if it's not broken, why fix it syndrome? Which, yes, perfectly captures, I think, what I've seen a lot of times. So yeah, this is the cool thing about this purpose step as well, though. It's very important, but it also acts as our jumping off point to get to the next stage of dysfunction mapping, which is to define a solution. So what is something I can do that will create a meaningful change? So by looking at that purpose statement, I'm basically asking myself, well, what could I do that would help that purpose to be understood? Not how do I enforce, not how do I inflict a way of working on people, but how do I help people to understand that purpose that we just talked about? Because again, this isn't about coming to some predetermined outcome that I as a coach or a Scrum Master have decided upon. This is about bringing people along on that journey and potentially even coming up with their own solutions, which in my experience is really the key to real long-lasting change. And so moving on to the next step, right, that's the solution. What we're trying to do is come up with a solution hypothesis. So it says solution on the board just because I wanted a single word for each of these columns, but it really is important to remember that it's still a solution hypothesis at this point. It's, I believe that I can take this action to have an outcome, but that's still something that I need to test. We think it'll make things better. We think it'll have a positive impact, but we then need to define a way forward, a way of testing that. And to be honest, this is the hard part, right? Like if you could just snap your fingers and come up with an action plan, you probably wouldn't be here listening to me talk. So again, in the full workshop, I provide a bunch more guidance, and as part of some of the templates that I can tell you about later, there's a bunch of tools I can give you to help you more easily come up with a solution hypothesis. So these solution cards that I've created represent a bunch of different lenses that I tend to bring when I'm problem solving. So you can see there are ones there for, say, the Scrum values, focus, commitment, respect. There are ones there for the 6 stances of a Scrum Master. If you're not familiar with that, Barry Overeem has a fantastic article on Medium you should read. But it's a really great way of thinking about problem solving, right? Can I act as a mentor? Can I act as a teacher? Can I act as a facilitator? And then there's other ones there that are just extra things that I think about, like, expert specialists or automation. The idea here is you would look at your purpose statement and draw one of these cards and say, right, could this tool, could this lens give me a path to helping that purpose to be understood? And to give a few more concrete examples that hopefully put this in a bit more context. Here we've got that purpose that I mentioned earlier. So the single sprint goal helps to provide focus and enable rapid decisions. So I want to help people understand that. And so I might, for example, draw the mentor card and think, right, okay, I could mentor someone in the team. Oh, that's right. We've got a BA in the team that's worked in a highly functioning Scrum team before. They know all about creating sprint goals. So maybe I could work one-on-one with them, help them come up with some example sprint goals that they could bring to the team, and then kind of show the team and lead them through finding a better way of practicing this. I could also draw the sprint planning card, for example, right? And I could think, oh yeah, actually sprint planning is the perfect place to start asking the repeat question of what is our goal for the next sprint? And to be honest, sometimes you're going to draw a card and you're going to be like, no, I don't think that's going to help me. And that's fine, right? You can draw a different card, or maybe it just triggers a completely different thought and you come up with your own idea. That's fine, because again, we're coming up with a hypothesis. There's no right or wrong answer. This is just about getting that creative process going so that you can come up with some stuff that you can potentially do. What we're really looking for is, can I form a hypothesis that makes sense with the information that I currently have available? That's step one, right? And so if you do, what you're looking to get is essentially a few actions, a few solutions on that next stage, that next column of your dysfunction map. Ideally, you want a few for each, right? So more than one solution gives you flexibility. So an example of that is I might choose some stuff related to the teaching stance that involves getting everyone in a room and doing, a full day of learning Scrum, for example. But I might struggle to get buy-in to do that too often. So maybe as a backup, I also want something that uses the mentoring stance so that I can do a bit of one-on-one with the product owner or someone else. Again, more solution options gives us a bit of flexibility. But generally, a warning there is you don't want to try and implement too many solutions at once, because then you'll have no idea which things are having an impact or not. So the idea of creating multiple solutions at this point is to give you flexibility about which one or two things you go after first, not about trying to do everything at once. And hopefully what you can now see on this board that we're looking at, right, is that we've got a bit of a neat flow that starts to form our solution hypothesis, right? We're going from the left to the right, and it says, well, I believe that if I take this action, it will help this purpose to be understood. If that purpose is understood, I hope that this dysfunction will go away. And if the dysfunction goes away, then the symptoms that we observed originally, they might start to disappear or maybe go away entirely. And this starts to look now like a concrete plan of action, right? This is something you can do that will really potentially make a positive impact to your team and to your organization, and something that hopefully will have a lasting impact because it's really tied to that purpose. Now, finally, everything we've done so far is a hypothesis, right? I've used that word a lot. That means that we don't know that it's going to have an impact. And in order to check, in order to test it, we need to have something to measure. And there's a great quote from Peter Drucker that says, you can't improve what you don't measure. That is a bit of a contentious one. I do quite regularly have people say to me that actually you can improve things that you don't measure, which I think is probably true. But my experience is that it's really, really hard to know if your actions are having the intended outcome if you're not measuring something, because any number of things could be the cause of change. And what you need is something specific that ties your actions to the things you're observing and says, am I having the impact that I want to have? Do I know if my actions are the cause? Am I changing the right things? Ultimately, to prove or disprove my hypothesis. And this normally is kind of one of the hardest parts about creating a plan for change, right? There's all sorts of metrics out there that people argue over on LinkedIn, if you're lame like me at least. Lots of different discussion about what's useful or what's not. And we've all probably seen some of the craziness with velocity being weaponized against teams, or burn down charts being tweaked at the end of the sprint so that nothing goes over the line. There are lots of ways that metrics can be used for bad. And so figuring out what to measure can be really, really difficult. Thankfully, though, if I do say so myself, this is where dysfunction mapping's magic really starts to kick in, because by going through this process and doing the steps in the way that we've done it, you've already done all the hard work and all of the thinking that you need to identify your measures. Because all you need to do is what I call close the loop, and actually go back to the beginning of the process and look at your symptoms and then ask, what would I expect to see change if one of these symptoms were to go away or to lessen? You're essentially taking those symptoms and just flipping them on their heads and saying, how would I measure if this symptom went away? And sometimes those are going to be hard, quantitative measures, like percentage of work items that are complete at the end of the sprint, right? Something you can measure in an absolute fashion. Sometimes you'll use softer qualitative measures. So things like, how confident is the team in their releases, that you might just do a survey or even a fist of 5 with the team to kind of gauge at a regular basis. These are not, measures of success in the traditional sense. They're not about telling us that we're great or amazing or, the best people in the world at our jobs. These are just a way of testing our hypothesis. So they don't need to always be super exact, metrics that we get out of Jira that can be checked over time. Sometimes it's enough to just gather enough information to check where we are now and then check again where we are in a couple of weeks and just see how trends change over time. Because in particular, if you can do that for a few symptoms that are all connected, well, now you actually start to get a really good sense of if you're having an impact in the way that you want to have and whether your hypothesis is accurate or not. And if it turns out it's not, then that's great because you've now learned something, right? You can revisit your dysfunction map, you can readjust, come up with a new hypothesis and try to make another way to change. But when you are correct, when you change things in the right direction, you've now got a great place to kind of exponentially and incrementally improve by checking those things over time and continuing to take small actions to improve things. So again, hopefully you can read some of those examples that were there, but we'll show a couple more in a sec. Another last thing you might have expected by this point is I've created some more cards because again, I found that I've learned a lot of really cool and interesting ways to gather metrics over the years that a lot of people are not super familiar with. And so I've created a bunch of these cards that kind of help people. And again, the idea here is you would look at one of your symptoms and then you would look through your cards and see if one of those gives you a way that you could measure a change over time. So some of these are really, well-known and quite hard measures. So for example, you could measure lead time or cycle time. But some of these are things that I've come up with that are just, not that I've invented, but that I've put on these cards based on my experience that just give you quick ways of checking information. So there's one there that just says survey, right? I can regularly check out of 5, how are people feeling on a certain topic? Does that change over time? Or even the daily checklist. This is one that I used to use when my teams were really struggling with keeping their daily scrum within the time box. And I was trying to observe to see if my coaching activities were helping them make the most of that activity. And I would simply have a checklist Monday to Friday, and I would do a tick if it was below 15 minutes and a cross if it was over 15 minutes. And in the early days, they would get more crosses than ticks. And then over time, I would hope to see more ticks appearing, right? So more daily scrums being kept under the 15-minute time box. Again, none of these measures are perfect or correct or the right way to measure things. This is about giving you a few ways that you can check to see if you're seeing a change over time in the direction that you want on the things that you've been coaching against. So are my activities actually, affecting things in the way I want to affect them? So I'll quickly talk through, now that we've kind of gone through the whole process, that's the loop, right? That's how we get through dysfunction mapping. I've got a few examples I can put on screen. We can talk through them really specifically. So here there is, and these are all examples of real teams that I've worked with, just FYI. So here's a team that struggled with work rollover, right? Every sprint, they were constantly pushing work that was unfinished into the next sprint. They had testing bottlenecks, so they felt like they were constantly waiting on testers at the end of the sprint. They had pointless daily scrums that felt like a status update that the team didn't think were useful. And in this case, I've hypothesized that the team was not setting a single sprint goal, and that could be the root cause here. Because I know from my experience that a single sprint goal is an important part of Scrum, and it seems to me that all of those symptoms could be resolved if the team had the focus and clarity provided by a single sprint goal. So I've had a couple of potential solutions there. I've decided I could bring some data to a retro that shows the relationship between setting sprint goals and how likely they are to get things done. Because sometimes they set 1 sprint goal, sometimes they set 3 sprint goals, sometimes they don't set a sprint goal at all. And the data probably shows something useful about which of those approaches works best for them. And the other thing I've said that I can do is run a sprint goal workshop. So act as a facilitator, bring everyone together and teach and learn how to build sprint goals together. So if these things are related in the way that I think they are, what I should see as a result is some of the symptoms lessening, which I'll measure in the way of, well, there should be fewer items rolling over at the end of each sprint. I should see the team discuss the sprint goal more regularly at the daily scrum. I should see fewer work items going backwards from test into dev. And I should see fewer unrelated, non-sprint goal related work items being pushed in or pulled into the sprint halfway through. This is now a hypothesis I can test. I can take one of my actions and I can see if these things change. And just to quickly run through another example that I've got here. This one is a team that struggles to self-manage themselves at sprint planning. They feel constantly overworked. They feel like their stakeholders and their product owners don't think that they're particularly effective. And in this case, I think the lack of a single product backlog could be the cause, because I know that a single source of work is important and this team doesn't have one. And if that hypothesis is correct, I could run a backlog building workshop, or I could coach the stakeholders on effectively using the front door process and not pushing work into the teams. And as a result, I should hopefully expect to see developers talking more at sprint planning now that they're more confident in what they're doing. I should see less context switching, more and improved feedback scores from stakeholders. Again, these could all be completely wrong. My hypothesis could turn out to be complete miss, and these things are not related at all. But even if that's true, I've now learned some stuff, and I can have another go at connecting some dysfunctions to some symptoms and come up with a new plan of attack. And so this basically is how this process works, right? You keep doing this, grouping themes, talking to stakeholders, and coming up with a hypothesis. This is a sort of a simplified example I've created for doing talks like this. So in reality, you'd see a bit more clustering. You'd have, one at the top that has lots and lots of symptoms, and maybe some at the bottom with fewer. But usually that's a good thing, right? Because that's a sign you found your first big win. Lots of clustering is a thing that's worth going after. If you can find a single dysfunction that solves, 5, 10 symptoms, that's a potential gold mine of proactive coaching. And just a final few things on this is, why is this useful, right? Has anyone ever been asked this question as a Scrum Master or a coach, like, what do you even do all day? I'm not sure if that's just me. Usually the guaranteed question to hurt our feelings, right, as coaches. In my experience, when we're true leaders, when we're servant leaders, we see our position as helping others to improve. And so we never want to take credit for the work that our teams are doing. And sometimes that makes it really, really hard for people to understand how we have actually helped or contributed to change. And so the cool thing about dysfunction mapping is that you actually have something visual that you can even take a step further, like I do, and turn it into a coaching backlog where each of your themes becomes a coaching Kanban sticky that you do things like limit work in progress and arrange into theme areas. And this gives you a way to visually share the particular things that you've gone after, the particular coaching approaches you're taking, and the measurable outcomes that those things have achieved, which you can talk to people about, share with people. And this gives you a bunch of extra flexibility, right? Because end of year performance reviews. I was once in a situation where I was working with two teams that were constantly struggling to integrate their work. And it was because they were basically both working from completely different branch and merge strategies. I facilitated a session that team came up with a solve. Sorry, one sec. Apologies, I'm recovering from COVID, so I've still got a bit of a cough. So in that scenario, the team got together, they came up with a new way of working, they resolved the problem, the merge issues went away. And 364 days out of the year, I would never dream of taking credit for the work that those teams did to solve that problem. When it came time to renew my contract, it was really, really cool to be able to point to my dysfunction mapping board and say, here's where I identified that there was a problem, here's where I facilitated a workshop, and as a result, this is what changed and how we measured it. And so while I'm not going to take credit for the work the team did, I could directly show how my activities contributed to that change. Same thing is useful for job interviews, right? Preloaded examples of ways that you've helped teams in the past, or even just talking to your family about what you do as a coach or a Scrum Master, which I know can always be painful. I'll just quickly wrap that up by summarizing that while we've talked about it in a kind of directional flow here, the process is meant to be iterative. You kind of revisit, go back to the beginning and refine as you go. And it's important that you kind of think about this in a critical way and don't just see it as a silver bullet tool, because there is a great quote here from John Knoll that says, any tool can be used for good or bad. It's really the ethics of the artist using it. For anyone who doesn't know, John Knoll is one of the designers, graphic artists at Industrial Light and Magic that do all the work for Lucasfilm. So he knows all about the way that CGI and the tools that he created can be used for evil. And the reason I mention this is because I do have a bit of a recurring fever dream about, KPMG or one of the big consultancies kind of picking up dysfunction mapping and using it as a way of selling a fixed solve or problem approach to an organization. And it is not that, right? This is a tool to help you come up with a plan for change that you will support, that you will help guide people on, and that you should think critically about, that will never, ever give you a single correct or right answer. So that's dysfunction mapping. We'll go to questions in a sec, but I'll just quickly wrap up by saying that I do regularly run those full workshops I mentioned throughout. It's a full day, 8-hour workshop. Sometimes it's one day, sometimes it's 2 half days, and it's built on liberating structures. It's about getting together and building a dysfunction map and learning by doing. And I have 2 of these actually planned in the near future. One of them is actually next week in person in Manchester. So any UK-based people that would like to come to that would be great to see you there. The other one is in February, and that one is online. And for that one, I have also created a discount code. So if anyone wants to come to that, if you use code HOA, you can get 25% off ticket prices for that session. There are also, though, a bunch of free templates on the Miraverse for using dysfunction mapping, for giving it a go without having to come to a workshop. And I'm also available on LinkedIn if anyone ever has questions about these and would like to dive into them in more detail. I do offer, obviously, all the usual consulting packages that we consultants do. And so if you, for example, have an entire team in your organization, you'd like me to come in and run a private workshop, I can do that. And I can also stick around before and after to help guide using dysfunction mapping as a way of solving problems and create real outcome-based coaching engagements. So that's enough of the sales pitch. I will quickly close on my last favorite quote of all time. One of the things that limits our learning is our belief that we already know something. And that's from Turn the Ship Around. It's really easy to get lost in the noise of complex systems, to take a wrong turn, to solve the wrong problem. It's really important as a result that we use an empirical approach, something that's tied to what really happens when we try to make a change, put our theory into practice and see what happens and learn from that. So dysfunction mapping is just one way that I've come up with to help people apply empiricism to our coaching and our leadership plans. And if it's piqued your interest, I would love to talk to you more. Obviously, you can reach out and we can do some of that together. But yeah, thank you all for listening. And I would love to take any questions or thoughts that anyone has at this point.
Awesome, Michael. That was really, really cool. Thanks a lot for sharing. And if you could provide me the links and the discount codes and stuff like that, I will share it to the with the attendees here and those who RSVP. That might be helpful. And yeah, we indeed have a lot of questions here, and I will feed you the first one in a second. There were some messages about will the recording be shared? Yes, of course. That's the purpose of the exercise, right? There's a YouTube channel with a lot of recordings of these kind of sessions, and it'll take about 3 to 4 weeks before the edited version will be online and available. So I'm not trying to pretend that I'm capable of editing video. That is doing someone who's actually a professional in that. Okay, Michael, you're good?
Yeah.
So the first one. What about other common iterative change management strategies? Which have you tried, and why have they failed for you? What do you think why they failed in your experience?
So I'm not sure I would necessarily say there's much that has failed. I think the reason that I came to this is because things like Kotter's change model, which I'm a big fan of, things like impact mapping, which are a really good way of coming up with approaches. They're all useful. They all have great things that have kind of become a part of me, I suppose, through osmosis. But when I was really looking at something specific and structured for Agile practitioners to solve problems, I wanted to share something that was closer to my specific practice that kind of takes bits and pieces from those things, but is really purpose-built for solving this particular problem. So I would not say in any sense that dysfunction mapping is the correct or the right way to do anything, or that other approaches aren't great, because there are lots of other great ways you could solve these problems. What I really just try to do is take, everything that I've learned from many other approaches and build it from the ground up to be, useful in the domain that I work. And now obviously to share that with other people who are working in the same domain, in the hope that it, helps them more quickly get to that kind of concrete change.
Okay, next one, the obvious one. Curious why the mapping moves from right to left.
Brilliant. Yeah, I always am unsure if someone's actually going to ask that question, because I always forget to mention it again. So really, it's kind of two things. Number one is I'm trying to what I call introduce deliberate friction to the process, to remind people that initial step of creating the map is not the most important bit, or where you should spend most of your time. What you're supposed to do is reflect on it regularly, check to see what's changing, go through your actions. And so it's weighted in a way that when you read it back from left to right, it's easier, but that initial step is a little bit harder. The second thing is, and the reason I've left it that way, even though people have asked me to change it the other way around, is because I don't want people seeing this as like some fixed process that you have to do it exactly the way I've described it to you. This is a tool that you can flex in whatever way makes sense to you. And I want to encourage people to think critically about the tool. And so if the first thing you want to do is flip it around and run it from left to right, you go right ahead, you do that. That would be great. And by kind of giving people a really easy thing that they can change, I've discovered that it kind of makes it almost like takes the pain away from changing other things, and people are more likely to experiment with the tool. And as a result, I've seen people doing some really interesting things, playing with the columns and theming things in different ways. And so I just want to encourage you to use it that way, right? It's not a fixed process. It's just a tool to help you be creative.
Next one, a system diagram of influencing factors often contains reinforcing loops. How do we make that work with the function trees which do not allow for loops?
It's a good point. So the basic sort of premise that I built this on was about simplifying it so that you can more quickly get to a hypothesis, not trying to give the illusion of certainty. And so when you think about some other models out there that like causal loop diagram, which I think is probably what you're referencing there. My experience of those is that they have two problems. One is they're very difficult for people to understand that are not very familiar with the process, but also they often, because they look very exact and specific, give people the illusion that they understand something better than they do. So part of the point of dysfunction mapping is to keep it simple enough that you never trick yourself into thinking you know exactly how these things connect, and only trying to get you to that point of a hypothesis that you can test, and then you revisit and you reevaluate. So a dysfunction map never has a final state. It's never finished. It's just a stepping stone that gets you to those hypotheses.
Long. Do you worry when you have identified a dysfunction that you could go deeper and perhaps get more possibilities? I'm thinking of the dangers of the 5 whys and the advantages of systems thinking as opposed to reductionist cause-effect models.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And interestingly, one of the ways that I've seen people kind of tweak the tool that I mentioned earlier is someone adding essentially a 5 whys analysis to the dysfunction or purpose step. Again, part of the point of this is about creating a space for you to be creative and come up with a hypothesis that you can test. So it's not about saying that you found the right answer. It's about finding an answer that allows a positive change. And one of the interesting things that I've found now that I've been using this with lots of different organizations and teams is that it's possible for two Scrum Masters, let's say, looking at the same system and the same set of symptoms to come up with two completely different approaches, two completely different reasons why they think something is wrong and what they can do about it. But also for both of those things to lead to a positive change when they take their action. So that's the nature of complex systems, right? There is very rarely a single path forward. And that's kind of the point here in the process, right? Is that you're never going to find the correct answer. What you're looking for is a step you can take that can be tested, that you can check against reality, that then gives you more information for your next iteration. Sometimes you're going to get it wrong. That's fine too. That's why we want to try and create your relatively small steps at each iteration and kind of see where that takes us.
Excellent. Next question. This seems to focus on practices and process. What is your approach for the foundational issues of mindset, values, behavior, and culture?
Yeah, so funnily enough, this is part of the challenge of the way that I teach dysfunction mapping, because it's a lot easier when I'm talking to a group of people like you all to use something like Scrum, which is essentially just a process, right? Because it's something we can all kind of agree on that has quite fixed rules. Whereas in reality, you can use dysfunction mapping with a lot of a wider lens. And for example, I mentioned earlier on, you could use the values from the Agile Manifesto itself, right? Like people and interactions over processes and tools. That's one of our values. We could go as simple as saying, I believe that we are not living that value, and here's a way that I could help that value to be understood. So you could go as philosophical, as process-oriented, as people-directed. You can go in almost any direction you want. The real key here is, I used that term before, of collective intelligence. It's about sort of relying on all of these other great approaches and tools that people have come up with, and finding the things that you think could solve problems for you, and not getting married to a single approach or a single framework, but rather saying, I'm seeing these problems. Here's an approach that I think might solve them. Let's try it.
Okay, this is a quick one. Are the Symptom Cards available on the Honest Agile website?
Funnily enough, I forgot to put a link in here. I have a Kickstarter running at the moment. I can send a link through to Stefan to send out.
Yes, please.
For physical versions of the cards that I'm planning to ship in March. So if you want like a workshop kit or individual set of cards, you can get those. But I'm very, very passionate about trying to give as much away for free as I can get away with. And so if you search on the Miroverse for Dysfunction Mapping Workshop, you will find a digital version of the workshop with all the digital cards free to download so that you can run that remotely with your teams whenever you like. But if you want the physical versions, the Kickstarter is up for getting those shipped in a little while.
Okay.
And Holger's just warned me about customs duty. Yeah. I keep getting very annoyed by all the various different taxes I have to pay on things. So yeah, I'm very upset by that.
Yes, I fully understand. How do you define purpose statements for dysfunctions? How do you get buy-in of the teams for these statements?
Yeah, really good question. So the you'll notice that was the one place where I didn't give people cards. Because the answer to that is you kind of have to figure that out for yourself. This is kind of the important part as a practitioner that I need to understand. Well, why does this rule exist, right? So using Scrum as that example is I should be able to come up with a fairly short, one sentence description of why this practice of Scrum exists that I think we're going to benefit from implementing. And if I can't, I should just spend some time self-reflecting, read the Scrum guide. I think I mentioned watching some YouTube videos. That's the learning activity. And that's the part in dysfunction mapping where I encourage people to step back and just take the time and think about it if they don't have the answer. And getting the buy-in on that, the second part of the question, that's how you test the purpose statement, right? Is if you can take it to someone who's not a Scrum Master, not an Agile coach, and say that purpose statement, they say, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like something I want to do. That's probably a sign that it's a good purpose statement. And if they say, no, that's stupid, okay, have another think, maybe look for a different attack vector.
How to prioritize what you pick up first next?
Yeah, so there's again, no right or wrong answer to this one. So my approach is generally all about the things that come up the most often. So when you're forming your themes, you're going to be collecting stuff together. You're going to have heard, 5 different people have said, I hate the daily Scrum, for example, or, 3 different people have said that the system breaks every time we push an update. And where you see a lot of clustering is a sign of a place to go first, because, multiple symptoms, multiple complaints usually indicate a big problem that's worth solving. But you might also include other criteria that's more, specific to your expertise or your context. You might simply look at something and say, I can tell from experience that this is a really big problem. And even though no one else can see it, I'm going to weight this thing more heavily. That's fine as well. Like I said, this is not a silver bullet. It's not a right or wrong. It's just about giving you a way to kind of beat the analysis paralysis and get to an action. And then the most important thing you do is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Try for something small. And then if it turns out that you're wrong, it's not a big loss, right? You can move on to stage 2.
Next one. Curious about clustering of symptoms and finding of the real cause. Is it a normal root cause analysis?
Sort of. Again, it's kind of similar to the last question is, this is partly your creativity, right? Again, this is not a tool that's going to tell you the right or wrong answer. It's a way to give you some structure for creativity. And so sometimes you might use other known tools that you might do a 5 whys analysis, a fishbone analysis. You might come up with a completely different way of getting to a root cause. Sometimes it just comes to you immediately and it's obvious, right? If you see a bunch of people complaining that the daily Scrum is a waste of time and you see that they're not setting a sprint goal, you might immediately connect those in your head because you've seen it a million times and you just know that that's something that's worth exploring. Again, the thing that kind of anchors all this is that you don't have to get it right first time. As long as you've got something you can test, as long as you can get to those measures, then you can give something a go and see what happens.
Do you identify impacts or the symptoms, dysfunctions, or do anything else to understand how to prioritize which to address? Understanding the impact seems to be a missing piece.
Yeah, but again, part of this is easier when we've got more time in like the workshop to talk about it. And so there's different activities, but I think the main thing for that part is about bringing other people on board. So again, I've talked about this in a very kind of insular way here because I'm just explaining the process. But in the real world, you'd want to collaborate with other people, right? Talk to your team and say, hey, I've identified this. What do you think? bring in experts in particular fields and say, oh, I think our testing strategy is a problem. I'm going to pull in a testing expert and get their feeling on what's going on here. A lot of the time, if you talk to a few people, the patterns tend to emerge and give you a good sense of where you should go. And like I've said a bunch of times, it's fine if you're wrong. So you don't need to stress too much about getting the right answer. You're just looking something that you can conceivably say with the information at hand. I believe that if I take this action, this thing might, this might go away. This symptom might be resolved. Now let's test it and see what happens.
Are you sharing all of your written down symptoms with the team? This is all what you are doing wrong in the sense?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I talk about this a bunch in the workshop. There's basically two ways of running dysfunction mapping in general, right? So one of those is when you're in a highly psychologically safe, autonomous kind of organization where it's okay to just talk about and share all the problems that people have. I have worked in organizations like that, and in that case, you can literally make the entire dysfunction map public, talk about it with people, and just write everything down, and it's great. A lot of organizations don't like that, and there are people that would be very, very upset by seeing complaints that might apply to them, or criticisms of behaviors of teams or managers, for example. So in those cases, you might treat the dysfunction map itself as more of a behind closed doors tool for you. But it's important that in that case, what I don't mean is that you just do the whole thing and come up with all the answers by yourself. What it means is that you selectively collaborate with people at different points, bringing them in where it's safe to do so, but not necessarily revealing the whole map to everyone. So for example, gathering symptoms, but then simplifying them into general topics before you share them back to someone, that kind of thing. But it should always be collaborative in some way. It should never be something you do just by yourself.
Hey.
Yeah, and I can see, Bart has said there in the comments, renaming dysfunction to risk could help. Yeah, a bunch of people have said to me that, I literally can't say the word dysfunction because people will get mad at me for that. Oh, that's a candidate for something you can tweak and adjust for your context, right? Just choose a new name and off you go.
The mindset, values, principles, practices slide could be interpreted as there is only one mindset.
Oh, good point. Yeah. So I like the graphic because it's, simply gets the point across, but you're right. Really all I'm trying to illustrate there is the importance of understanding that there are different approaches. And like you say, that also applies to kind of the mindset view of the world, right? There's no one correct mindset. The only thing I want, practitioners of dysfunction mapping to be clear on is that there is no correct way to solve a problem. There are hypotheses, there are things that will make things better, and there are things that might make things worse, and that we need to measure lots of different things to be able to get a sense of the direction that takes us. So getting too hung up on one approach, like even being a big advocate for Scrum and someone that uses Scrum a lot, I would never say that a team should just do Scrum all the time because it's the right thing to do. I think of Scrum as a tool that helps to solve certain kinds of problems, and that mindset is among the mindsets that tend to lead to more productive change plans in my experience.
Speaking of Scrum, do you think that Scrum anti-patterns identified by Stefan could automatically fill your diagram? I would be interested in that too.
I think that's a great question. I actually was just saying to Stefan earlier, so I haven't read the book yet, but I have just ordered it on Amazon. I suspect that it will become a reference material that I point to a lot for dysfunction mapping, because, I don't want to just use all my experiences of anti-patterns. But yeah, I think the dysfunction cards that I mentioned at one point that I have examples of in one of the Miro boards, those are all based on my descriptions of dysfunctions. Same for the symptoms. The Scrum Anti-Patterns Guide is probably full of a bunch of others that you could use. So again, if they help you to identify something and say, that doesn't feel right, let's try and change it, then it's a useful tool.
Yeah, it could be. I'm really curious about how you get along with the content of the book, because it's basically built on a very simple pattern. So there's an observation, something that is not right. Then there is some sort of analysis. Okay, how this supposed to be, and why is it a good idea that it is supposed to be in that way? And now, why might be the reason? What might be the reasons that actually people change that attitude and try a different approach? So, for example, this quick example I had only yesterday. So technically, we say it's uncool to show undone work at the sprint review. No, we don't do that. However, if you have a closer look at this, there might be good reasons to do that from time to time, depending on the context and the culture of the organization. And what are you working on? Imagine that you work on some piece of machine learning or so, and for the next 3 months, you will not have anything to present, but you're working every day. And couple that with a culture where busyness is rewarded, where you need to be seen as someone who is actively contributing to the sustainability of the organization. You will be in trouble. Because basically for 3 months, you will be flying under the radar. And if your stakeholders attend every sprint review, they will be looking at you sooner or later. What are you doing here? So there might be a reason for that. So it's not black and white. It's a lot of shades of gray, depending on the situation.
I totally agree. And so, I think we're doing the same thought process just from a different direction, right? Because my way of looking at it is it's not about saying you must always follow this rule for every reason or at every time. It's about saying, are we experiencing or seeing some negative outcomes that if we did follow this rule would be addressed? Because if so, it might be worth experimenting with. But if it's not going to solve some observable problems, let's not just try and enforce a rule for the sake of it.
Yes, totally agree. Totally agree. So a lot of the anti-patterns from the book will end up in something like, okay, here's a list of things that you can try and that you should consider before you start anything. Or the why, the reason, the reasons, the possibilities that you have. Okay, have a look at the context. Are you working in a psychological safe environment? Who is the individual that you are talking to? What is their psychological state? Etc. pp. There's so many aspects. It's really complex. But that's why I'm so really excited about the dysfunction mapping now that I have a better understanding.
Yeah, cool. So everyone else could look out for our collaboration that we'll do at some point in the future, eh?
Yeah, I'm really curious about your feedback regarding the book. So, next one. How to order the implementation of the solution.
Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Yeah, how to order the implementation of the solutions.
Okay, cool. So for me, I talk about just giving you choices. So essentially, that's one of those collaboration opportunities. Once you come with a few solutions, take them to your team and your stakeholders and ask for their input on which ones to go after. Because an example of the way that my bias can land me into trouble is I love teaching. I love nothing more than getting into a workshop, building activities, building training content, and showing people how to do stuff. I have worked in teams in the past where they hate doing workshops. So if I just went with what I wanted to do, the team would probably hate me by the end of it. So I can go with a few options, and sometimes they might say, oh yeah, the workshop in this case sounds great. But other times they might say, no, can we just do, this little activity or the video that you recommend that we could watch, or, the Henrik Nyberg video on limiting work in progress is one that comes up on my dysfunction maps a lot because it's a really simple and easy way to help people understand the purpose of limiting work in progress. I will just send them the video. So having a few options that are like various levels of commitment, let's say, and then bringing those to the team as options can be a really useful way to kind of decide where to go.
Okay. Is it, in your opinion, reasonable to include the dysfunction mapping in OKRs?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So it's not something I've done sort of explicitly, but I have used dysfunction mapping in organizations that use OKRs, and kind of as a second order process, I've kind of tied those up as a way of kind of sharing with people what I'm doing and why it's useful. And I have seen someone actually create a version of a dysfunction map template that has a thing on the other side for OKRs. So it's definitely something you could think about. I think if you're in an organization that's using OKRs well, it's a really good thing to be using to, particularly thinking about for your measures, but even just as a guide for the process or the actions that you're taking. If you're in an organization that's using OKRs destructively, which I've seen a few times, maybe you just want to ignore them, or maybe they become a dysfunction on your dysfunction map. Again, this is about your creativity, right? So depending on your context, what's useful to you, right? If the OKRs would help support it, great. If not, don't do it, right? This is about what you think you can do to solve problems.
Okay, another one, just two left. Symptom metrics are mostly output metrics. Could we also measure against the root cause?
Oh, so if I understand the question correctly, is that saying using the dysfunction and creating a measure for it as well? Which, yes, I've done that as well, because often what actually happens is it's not super clear to me the first time whether something is a symptom or a dysfunction. And so what I'm really doing is just pulling out one of my symptoms and saying, oh, I think this is actually the dysfunction. I'm going to put that here. And in which case, it is also something that's worth measuring. So yes, and really simple ones. Team sets a sprint goal. If the dysfunction is they do not set a sprint goal, one of the simplest things I can measure is how frequently does the team set a single sprint goal. And one of the measure cards that I have is time since, which is literally just measuring the number of days that go until a bad thing happens, right? So how much time can pass before the team forgets to set a sprint goal or doesn't set a sprint goal. And so, yeah, that would be measured against the dysfunction rather than the symptoms. And it gives you another way of checking if you're kind of moving in the right direction. Has the team understood the value of a sprint goal? So definitely worth thinking about.
There's one question left. How do you create a single sprint cycle goal when you are doing Kanban with, for example, 4 product goals?
Yeah, really good point. And this comes back down to that view of it depends on the context of your team, right? You don't have to use a Scrum lens for this. So if you're in a team that is using Kanban and has no interest currently in Scrum, you're probably not going to pull in Scrum examples and say that the team should set a sprint goal. What you might do is focus on the team is not using work in progress limits, or the team isn't making their policies explicit. There are other things that you might lean on. Or you might actually see this as a way to introduce a process that would be useful to the team. So maybe actually the team is in a context where Scrum would make a lot of sense. And in which case, rather than just trying to do a wholesale switch, one of the things that you could bring in is, well, let's just try sprints and setting a single sprint goal and see if that helps improve the things that we want to improve. Again, it's all about that experimentation view, right? This is about, can I try to change something with the team or help the team to come up with a change that will help them and see what happens. And so you don't want to tie it always to Scrum if the team's not using Scrum. One of the examples I often use is scaling frameworks. I would never introduce SAFe to a team that's not using SAFe personally. But if you're in an organization that is using SAFe and the team is using SAFe, well, then you might want to lean on some of the rules of SAFe and say, actually, if we do this, it could solve some of our problems. So it's just about that view of, can this thing help us to solve a problem? If it can, use it. If it doesn't, ignore it. Tools are just tools, frameworks are just frameworks. You don't have to always follow them blindly.
Michael, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing dysfunction mapping with us and giving us this insight, and also providing us with a discount code for the online session. Really looking forward to that one. We have everything recorded. Hope it will be available in early February. I will let you know the link to it. And by the way, YouTube, meanwhile, automatically creates transcriptions. So you can switch that on when watching it. I will notify you about the availability of the video. And I hope that you will join us the next time. By the way, the next time we have Johanna Rothman on March 5th, and we talk about fake agility. I still have to create the event, pardon me, but it'll be available tomorrow or so, and you will get a notification from Meetup for the next one. Okay, then. So,
brilliant. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for attending and your patience, and see you next time around.
Cheers,
Bye.
team.